Think the Middle Ages were romantic. Try bathing once a year, toothless nobles and chamber pots flying out windows. Welcome to the Stink Age. Think your roommate smells bad? Try walking into a medieval tavern after harvest season 20 unwashed men, one fire pit, and the unmistakable aroma of sweat, wet wool and regret. People didn't shower because they believed water could literally kill you. Or worse, invite demons into your body. Hygiene wasn't just overlooked, it was actively avoided. Cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was next to heresy. Let's get one thing straight. The Middle Ages did not smell like candlelight and roasted pheasant. They smelled like a wet barn wearing old cheese as cologne. Every alley, every home, every noble banquet hall was a sensory assault. If you time travelled back to 1350, your nose would file a resignation letter within minutes. Modern noses just aren't built for that level of suffering. There's a reason medieval paintings never depict anyone sniffing the air. Here's a fun fact to kick things off. Most people in medieval Europe believed that taking regular baths was dangerous. Not just oops, I caught a cold, dangerous, more like you just opened a highway for demonic possession dangerous. Bathhouses were around sure, but were often associated with sex, sin and syphilis. If you were squeaky clean, people would worry you were either a prostitute or possessed. Either way, someone was going to pray for you, or burn you. Now before you say, hey, they probably didn't notice the smell, let me stop you. They noticed. There are diaries, actual writings, where people complain about the stench of cities, of other people, of themselves. One 14th century monk compared his own feet to rotten eggs left in the sun. And that was probably a good day. If your socks walked away on their own, you were just part of the crowd. But the best part? The stink wasn't confined to peasants. Oh no! Kings, queens, bishops, they all marinated in their own glorious filth. Queen Elizabeth famously bathed once a month whether she needed it or not. That was considered progressive. Meanwhile, the peasants were too busy dodging plague rats and stepping in communal sewage to worry about personal fragrance. Let me paint you a picture. You wake up on a straw mattress crawling with bedbugs. You put on the same tunic you've worn for 19 days. Breakfast is stale bread, beer, and maybe something you fished out of a bucket. Then you step outside, mud to the ankles, animals pooping freely, and someone is literally dumping a chamber pot from a second-story window. You barely flinch. That's just Monday in the 1300s. And yet they carried on. They married, had feasts, went to church, fought wars, wrote poetry, all while covered in layers of dirt, sweat, and medieval mystery. It's impressive, really. You complain about a delayed Uber. They went to battle with a yeast infection and a wooden spoon. So before we dive deeper into the glorious details of medieval hygiene, or lack thereof, let me leave you with this little nugget. The next time someone says I was born in the wrong era, please, for the love of your nostrils, ask them if they enjoy wiping with hay. Because we're about to take a deep nose-wrinkling dive into the age where funk was forever. Welcome to the Stink Age. Let's start with this medieval logic gem. If God made you dirty, who are you to clean it off? Bathing wasn't seen as hygienic, it was borderline blasphemous. Water was for drinking blessing, and occasionally drowning witches, not for lathering your medieval butt cheeks. The church taught that the body was sinful and tempting, so covering it up in layers of wool and never exposing it even to soap was the righteous thing to do. Dirt became a virtue. Smelling like a damp goat was basically proof you hadn't sinned via vanity. But wait, it gets better. During the Black Death, people actually stopped bathing more because they believed that opening your pores made you vulnerable to plague vapours. That's right, if you scrubbed too hard, Satan might slide in through your armpits. So instead, they doubled down on filth. Think of it like medieval sunblock, a thick layer of grime to ward off death. The logic was airtight if you're high on religious paranoia and rat stew. Now, to be fair, some bathhouses did exist, but they weren't exactly your neighbourhood spa. Most were steamy sex dens where people did a lot more rinsing than reflecting. You'd go for a bath and leave with a communicable disease and maybe a bastard child, which is why the church eventually banned a bunch of them or tried to rebrand them as places of sin. Bathing became scandalous. Washing your feet was practically foreplay. For those brave enough to bathe at home, it was a full production. You'd have to lug buckets of cold water from the well, heat it over a fire for hours, and pour it into a giant wooden tub that also served as a laundry basket and occasional coffin. Families shared the same water in the same order, starting with the father, then the mother, and down to the baby. By the time little Tommy got in, he was basically marinating in soup made of everyone else's dirt. This is where the phrase "don't throw the baby out with the bathwater" literally came from. And the tub. Oh, it didn't live in a nice bathroom. It was hauled into the kitchen, or worse, the barn, where the smell of hay dung and mildew added some notes to your washing experience. There was no soap, just maybe some lye or ash if you were fancy. The process took hours, left you shivering, and made you a prime target for gossip. People didn't say, "Wow, she's so clean," they whispered, "Why is she so clean?" Suspicious. Possibly French. Speaking of the French, they actually had a reputation for bathing more than the English, which made the English very uncomfortable. In medieval England, bathing was seen as something foreigners did probably while plotting to steal your sheep and seduce your wife. So if you washed too often, you weren't just vain, you were untrustworthy. Cleanliness was political. Dirty hands, honest soul. Clean hands, witchcraft. Still think you'd enjoy being a princess in a castle. Picture this: you're wearing 20 pounds of unwashed linen and velvet, sweating in a stone room with no windows, and the last time you bathed was when you were 5. You smell like a mixture of horse-mouldy cheese and regret, and your handmaid just fainted from the fumes under your dress. But hey, you're royalty. So yes, in the grand medieval rulebook, bathing was a dangerous, scandalous, possibly soul-damning act. Hygiene could make you sick. Smelling awful made you holy. And now you know why every painting from the 1300s looks like no one's breathing through their nose. Let's clear something up when we say bathhouse. We don't mean marble floors, eucalyptus steam and cucumbers on your eyes. Medieval bathhouses were more like lukewarm people, soup with a side of syphilis. Imagine a wooden shed full of strangers, sweaty. Steam rising from reused water and a guy named Gerald clipping his toenails in the corner. No privacy, no filtration, just a room full of naked people simmering like sad dumplings. Bathhouses were technically places to clean yourself, but the medieval definition of clean is a loose, wobbly concept. First of all, the water was rarely changed. Some bathhouses only drained the tubs once a week. Let that sink in. Monday through Sunday, the same stew of body grease, hair, fleas and floating mystery chunks. If you left the bath without catching something, you were considered blessed. Probably got canonized on the spot. People didn't go there alone either. Bathing was social, romantic, even festive. You could rent a private room with your lover, order food, and even drink wine while scrubbing each other's medieval bits. Think date night at Applebee's, but replace the booths with barrels and the nachos with body lice. In fact, bathhouses were such hotspots for sex and scandal, they started getting nicknames like stew houses, which is somehow both clever and disgusting. And what did the church do when they realised bathhouses were becoming brothels with better lighting? They panicked, of course. Sermons were delivered, sins were listed, demonic consequences were implied. But the people they kept on scrubbing and sinning. Because if you're already risking hell by cleaning your armpits, you might as well get a little action while you're at it. Eventually things got so wild that laws had to be passed to keep the steam sessions PG-13. Some cities banned men and women from bathing together. Others declared bathhouses dens of vice and shut them down altogether. Naturally, this didn't stop anything. It just pushed the whole messy, lusty operation underground. Secret stews, shadowy scrubs, whispers in alleyways. You clean, bro. Of course not everyone went for the bathhouse experience. It cost money. Peasants couldn't afford it, and even if they could, they probably wouldn't want to bathe next to a knight with visible fungus on his sword arm. So communal bathing became a status thing. The rich got steamy and sinful. The poor stayed crusty and proud. Everyone reeked, but at least the elites reeked in style. Still, for all its filth and fornication, the bathhouse served one important purpose. It delayed the invention of soap for a few extra centuries. Because why bother with personal hygiene when you could just outsource your grime to a communal cesspool and call it a night? Just don't forget to bring your own towel, and maybe a cross. Soap as we know it today, soft-scented, bubbly and Instagrammable, was basically science fiction in the Middle Ages. Most people didn't know what it was, didn't want it, and frankly didn't trust it. If you asked a medieval peasant about soap, they'd probably squint at you like you'd just asked where the Wi-Fi password was kept. And if you did manage to find some, it was about as gentle as a cheese grater dipped in bleach. Soap back then was made from a hellish combo of wood ash, animal fat, and whatever regrets they had lying around. The result? A gritty, foul-smelling, skin-peeling brick that could remove grease in and several layers of epidermis in one go. Using it felt like exfoliating with a burning log. It didn't smell like lavender or vanilla or anything remotely comforting. It smelled like a barn-caught fire. And people only used it for laundry, not bodies. Clothes got the soap. Your skin got judgment. Even among the clean elite, soap was controversial. Some nobles imported fancy versions from the Middle East that were smoother and less horrifying, made with olive oil or herbs. These were luxury items, often perfumed, but using them on your body, that was still risky business. The church was busy whispering about spiritual danger and excessive bodily attention, as if washing your butt somehow meant you were dabbling in sorcery. And let's not forget the regional weirdness. In France, soap makers were considered craftsmen. In England, they were practically warlocks. Germany, somewhere in between, depending on the century and the smell in the air. But universally, the common folk weren't lining up for bars of medieval Irish Spring. Most just rubbed themselves with cloth and hoped friction would dislodge the dirt. Spoiler, it didn't. There was also a widespread belief that simply changing your clothes counted as getting clean. You'd remove your undergarments, put on slightly less offensive ones, and go about your day with a fresh layer of stink. The logic: the fabric absorbed the filth, so new fabric, just new person. This was considered so effective that in some royal courts changing clothes 3 times a day was encouraged, as long as you never actually touched water. Clothes were the soap, and prayer was the rinse. So while we modern folks argue about bar soap versus body wash, our ancestors were still deciding whether scrubbing themselves with lard and fire dust was worth the spiritual risk. And more often than not, they landed on nah. Instead, they bathed in cologne superstition and self-delusion. Because when you're marinated in filth and fear, what's one more layer? Dental hygiene in the Middle Ages was a bit like unicorns. People liked the idea, but no one actually saw it. Brushing your teeth? Not a thing. Toothpaste. Only if you count crushed charcoal-powdered bones or dried mint leaves ground into a chunky dust that doubled as rat poison. Most folks simply chewed on sticks and hoped for divine intervention. And floss please. If something got stuck between your teeth, you either swallowed it or accepted it as part of your identity. It wasn't just peasants walking around with dental disasters royalty had wrought too. Monarchs with blackened stumps for teeth were not only common, they were expected. Henry VIII supposedly had teeth so bad his courtiers stood downwind. And because sugar was a luxury item mostly for the rich, the wealthy actually had worse teeth than the poor. That's right, the more power you had, the more your mouth looked like a haunted house. Breath, meanwhile, was a biological weapon. Forget garlic or onions. Medieval breath was forged in the depths of digestion, tooth decay, and perpetual infection. Imagine a man who's never brushed his teeth, drinks ale all day, and eats nothing but salt pork and boiled cabbage, and now he wants to tell you about his dreams, up close, with confidence, and no apology. Dentists existed technically, but they were more like part-time butchers with a flair for violence. Got a toothache. Here's a wooden chair, a shot of ale, and a guy named Magnus with iron pliers and zero regrets. No anesthesia, no hygiene, just screaming, and the hope that you'd pass out before the abscess exploded. Some folks didn't even go to the tooth yanker. They just tied a string around the bad tooth, and a door handle said a prayer, and yanked. Dentistry by DIY. And let's not forget the oral health advice passed down through generations: rinse your mouth with wine-chew herbs or rub crushed emeralds on your gums if you were very rich and very dumb. Some believed kissing a donkey's nose could cure a toothache. Others thought rubbing dog fat on your jaw would draw out the evil. Meanwhile, actual cavities were just tolerated until the tooth fell out or took you with it. So yes, in a world where dental care was both terrifying and non-existent, people learned to live with tooth pain the way we live with traffic or Mondays. Rotten molars were a rite of passage. Breath that could peel paint was a social norm. And if someone offered you a kiss, it came with the unspoken question: do you feel lucky, punk? Modern deodorant is a miracle we don't appreciate enough. Roll-on spray gel, pick your poison. In the Middle Ages, people fought body odour with herbs, hope, and heavy denial. There were no antiperspirants, no aluminum compounds, no floral scents, just sweaty pits and social acceptance. And if you did smell bad, congratulations, you were officially part of the human race. Stink was normal. Fragrance was suspicious. So what did people use to mask the rot? Enter the herbal necklace, literally a string of rosemary, lavender, or sage worn around the neck like a smelly amulet. They weren't wearing it for the aesthetic. It was body odour camouflage. People shoved dried herbs into their sleeves, undergarments, and get ready their armpits directly. That's right, a DIY sachet shoved under the pits, which is bold, honestly considering they'd also go months without changing their shirt. The logic was simple: bad smells were evil. Good smells were holy. So the more you smelled like a floral hedge, the better your chances of not being possessed by demons. Or, catching the plague. Miasma theory ruled the day. People thought disease travelled through foul odours, not germs, so masking your own stank was a survival strategy. Not for your friends, for your soul. But here's the kicker: nobody actually tried to stop sweating. Sweat was just a thing your body did, all day, while wearing 5 layers of wool, in the sun, on a horse. People didn't even think of preventing it, they just accepted it like rain or taxes or boils. And when it got too bad, you just layered on more herbs. Or prayed. For the rich things got fancier, but not necessarily better. Some aristocrats used perfume, strong musky concoctions that smelled like a spice rack exploded in a goat barn. They weren't subtle. The goal was to overpower the odour, not eliminate it. Think of it like spraying cologne on a dead raccoon and calling it a date. To medieval noses, this was alluring. To modern noses, it's a chemical assault. And let's not forget the people who went full fragrance armour. Cloaks lined with scented wax. Gloves perfumed with ambergris, yes, that's whale vomit. Handkerchiefs soaked in rosewater. Every item they wore had a job smell better than the body wearing it, which, to be fair, was a Herculean task, especially in July. So next time you dab on some deodorant and worry if it'll last through your spin class, remember your ancestors rubbed onions on their armpits and hoped the devil would stay away. You're doing fine. Let's get one thing straight. Medieval people didn't believe in washing clothes often. Not because they were lazy, okay? Also because they were lazy, but mostly because it was a monumental hassle. Washing required hauling water, boiling it, scrubbing everything by hand with soap that doubled as a corrosive agent, and then finding a way to dry your tunic without a clothesline or sunshine. So most folks just didn't. Instead, they wore the same outfit until it could stand up on its own and ask to be burned. And when I say washed annually, that's not a joke. For many, once a year was generous. Peasants might only wash their outer garments on major feast days like Christmas, Easter, or please God let the smell stop Sunday. Undergarments, if they existed, were swapped out a little more frequently, but even then frequent meant every couple weeks if you were lucky. Smelling like fermented barley was just how you knew someone had a job. Linen was the underwear of choice worn under wool, which trapped both heat and shame. Because linen was slightly easier to wash, it was considered your skin barrier. You'd never dream of washing your woolen overcoat unless absolutely necessary. You just beat the dirt out with a stick, hung it in the wind, and called it a day. If the breeze passed out, you knew it was working. Now the nobility had more options. They employed washerwomen who risked their lives dragging royal laundry down to rivers where they'd scrub stomp and boil clothes into submission. These women were often poor, overworked, and permanently pruny. And because some noble garments were so delicate and embroidered, washing them could literally ruin them. So instead of cleaning the clothes, they'd perfume them, air them out and pray no one noticed the Duke's robe smelled like pickled feet. And don't romanticize it, washing day was brutal. It wasn't cute laundry hanging on a line with birds chirping. It was you knee-deep in a freezing stream slapping pants against rocks while cursing your ancestors. Clothes were beaten, boiled, and bludgeoned into clean enough. Then they were dried on bushes, fences, or anything not covered in goose poop. Bonus points if it didn't rain. When clothes got too filthy to salvage, people didn't wash them. They turned them into rags, padding, or toilet paper. Yes, fabric had an afterlife. Your shirt could be reborn as shoe lining. Your socks might graduate to window caulk. Everything got reused and nothing got truly clean. So if someone looked fresh, it wasn't because they were hygienic. It was because they'd just stolen someone else's clothes. So the next time you do laundry and complain about separating whites from colours, remember at least you don't have to pound your underwear with a rock next to a guy pooping in the same river. Perspective. If peasants fought with pitchforks, the nobility fought with perfume. In the absence of soap baths or a single care about hygiene, the upper class waged olfactory warfare using bottles of scent so powerful they could stun livestock. Perfume wasn't just a luxury, it was a shield, a status symbol, and occasionally a biological hazard. Forget light floral spritzes. These were heady, musky medieval concoctions that said, I own land, 3 horses, and a stench that needs divine intervention. The ingredients were ambitious, musk from deer glands, ambergris, a waxy blob of whale vomit, Sivia secretion from the butt of a small cat-like mammal, all lovingly distilled with rose petals and vinegar bottled in glass and dabbed behind the ears like it wasn't made from emotional trauma. People didn't just wear perfume, they marinated in it. And when someone important entered a room, you knew it not because they said something, but because the smell entered 3 minutes before they did. Perfume was so central to noble life that entire wardrobes were perfumed. Gloves soaked in violet water, undergarments infused with frankincense. Even letters were scented because nothing says I miss you like a handwritten note that reeks of fermented blossoms and cat glands. Ladies carried pomanders, tiny scented balls worn around the neck or waist to keep the air bearable. Men, on the other hand, just dumped cologne on their cloaks and called it courtship. Subtlety was for peasants. This scent obsession wasn't just about attracting partners, it was a genuine attempt to survive the stench of court life. Castles were not fragrant places. You had mould meat, mud manure, and monarchs all rotting at varying speeds. Perfume became survival gear. Think gas mask, but sexy. It was less, I want to impress you, and more, I don't want to die while speaking to you. Naturally, this led to competition. Who smelled the richest? Who could afford the rarest ingredients? There were reports of nobles importing scent makers from the Islamic world just to get access to better recipes. France, Italy and Spain were ground zero for this aromatic arms race. If your perfume didn't cause lightheadedness or minor hallucinations, you were considered rustic. The goal was to dominate the room, preferably before your breath had a chance to introduce itself. But here's the twist, none of this made people cleaner. It just made the filth smell expensive. Perfume didn't kill bacteria, it ignored it. You'd have nobles drenched in lavender water who hadn't seen soap since birth. Their wigs had lice, their corsets had mould, their skin had questions. But as long as you smelled like 10 gold coins and a whale's digestive tract, you were socially acceptable. So the next time you spritz perfume before a date and wonder if it's too strong, remember somewhere in the 14th century a duke is nodding from beyond the grave, whispering, "Too strong is the goal." Just when you thought medieval hygiene had hit rock bottom, along came the Black Death like a cosmic prank with a body count. Starting in the 1340s, the plague swept through Europe like a goth teenager, through a mall killing anywhere from 1/3 to half the population. People were terrified, confused and desperate, so naturally they blamed bad smells. Not rats, not fleas, not bacteria which they hadn't invented yet, just vibes, specifically the foul ones. Enter the theory of miasma. The belief was that bad air rank, swampy, corpse-flavoured air was the source of all disease. And to be fair, medieval air was trying to kill you. But instead of cleaning up the streets or say not dumping poop out windows, people just tried to smell other things instead. You know, like flowers, vinegar, burned herbs, anything that wasn't rotting humanity mixed with goat. This gave birth to one of history's most iconic fashion fails, the plague doctor. You've seen the look, long, a black robe, wide-brimmed hat, and that horrifying beak mask like a bird auditioning for a horror movie. The beak was stuffed with herbs, spices and dried flowers to ward off the stench of death, which they believed was the disease itself. Inside that bird snout, rosemary, cloves, lavender and panic. The doctor couldn't cure you, but at least he wouldn't have to smell you die. People also began carrying posies, small flower bouquets to hold under their noses, while walking through cities that reeked of plague and panic. Ever heard the rhyme, "Ring around the rosy year"? That's not a cute children's song. It's about mass death. The rosy was the posy. The pocket full of posies was your mobile air freshener, and we all fall down is, well, you get it. Nothing says bedtime lullaby like trauma. But here's the real kicker. In a twisted twist of fate, the plague made bathing even more suspicious. People doubled down on the idea that hot water opened your pores and let in evil air. So any poor soul who thought washing might help avoid disease was met with side eyes and sermons. Priests preached against vanity. Doctors told people to avoid water, and cities banned bathhouses out of fear they'd turn into death hot tubs. In response, the wealthy started carrying elaborate scent dispensers, tiny jewelled orbs called pomanders, filled with solid perfume and hung from belts like medieval Fabrizi. Poorer folks clung to rosemary sprigs and bits of cloth soaked in vinegar. And everyone tried their hardest to outsmell the apocalypse. It didn't work, of course. You can't perfume your way through a pandemic. But by God they tried. So instead of facing the truth that the real culprit was flea-infested rats running wild in an unwashed society, people just kept sniffing lavender and blaming the air. Hygiene took a backseat to superstition. Bathing was the enemy, and the plague somehow managed to make the dirtiest period in European history even dirtier. Castles. The very word conjures up images of romance grandeur, maybe a brooding knight sipping mead on a misty balcony. But let's be clear, castles in the Middle Ages were not pristine fairy tale palaces. They were draughty stone fortresses stuffed with sweaty nobles, mouldy tapestries and chamber pots that hadn't been empty since the Crusades. In short, castles didn't smell like power, they smelled like failure to invent plumbing. The stench was everywhere, and it was democratic. No matter how high your tower or how blue your blood, you were still living in a giant glorified latrine. Most castles had something called a garderobe, which sounds fancy, but was essentially a toilet that dropped your waste straight down a chute and into the moat or worse, onto the heads of unsuspecting servants below. And yes, the moat. That picturesque body of water surrounding the castle, it doubled as a sewage pit. So while swans may have glided across the surface, they were swimming in aristocratic poop. Inside, things weren't much better. The kitchen's massive, smoky and rarely cleaned reeked of meat grease, and the kind of fish that only gets invited to dinner when it's too spoiled to say no. Food scraps were tossed on the floor, bones left to rot, and rodents scurried freely, basically paying no rent and contributing nothing to society. Upstairs, noblemen and ladies wore the same clothing for weeks, heavy with perfume and secrets. And because windows were small for defence and fires, were inconsistent for everything, most rooms smelled like damp wool ash and disappointment. Even the grand halls where banquets took place and minstrels droned on about honour were olfactory battlegrounds. Picture this 50 people packed into a stone room eating goose and garlic with their hands, drinking warm ale and burping freely while their dogs beg under the table. The floors were covered in rushes, straw or herbs meant to absorb spills, but they weren't changed often. So those fresh rushes turned into mouldy carpets of grease bones, spit vomit and the occasional dead rat. And yet people still hosted weddings there. Let's talk bedrooms or solar chambers if we want to get fancy. A noble's bed was a canopied wooden monstrosity stuffed with straw, and maybe feathers crawling with lice, and shared with children pets, or whichever knight passed out first. Privacy was a myth. Sanitation was an afterthought. If someone had a chamber pot, they were considered high-tech. If someone emptied it, they were a hero. Most just put it near the door and waited for a servant or gravity to deal with it. Oh, and pets. They were everywhere. Cats, dogs, falcons, even monkeys. Yes, monkeys roamed the halls, pooping where they pleased. Because nothing screams royalty like slipping on monkey droppings in your own throne room. Combine that with burning torches, spilled wine, and the general musk of medieval ambition, and you've got yourself an authentic olfactory experience. No wonder nobles preferred outdoor hunts. The forest smelled better. So next time you visit a restored castle and admire its majestic ceilings and echoing corridors, remember back in the day it reeked of smoke, sewage, spoiled meat, and sadness. Castles were power symbols, yes, but they were also stone-scented monuments to the fact that nobody had discovered plumbing yet. Long live the king, just don't breathe through your nose. You wake up in the middle of the night in a medieval home, stone-wall straw mattress, a vague sense of dread, and you need to pee. What do? No plumbing, no bathroom, no blessed porcelain throne with Bluetooth speakers. You reach for the humble chamber pot, a ceramic bucket of shame waiting silently at the bedside like a loyal but extremely unsanitary dog. Chamber pots were the go-to toilet solution for everyone from kings to kitchen boys. They came in all sizes, sometimes with a lid, sometimes with a handle, sometimes with a smell so strong it could resurrect a peasant, just to make them faint again. If you were fancy, your chamber pot might be decorated or even gilded, because nothing says power like defecating into a bowl, worth more than a servant's yearly wage. But let's be honest, no matter how pretty it looked, it still held the same medieval mystery stew. And eventually someone had to empty it. Spoiler that someone was never the person who filled it. Now, if you were truly high-born, you might have a groom of the stool. Sounds elegant, right? It wasn't. This was a real job. A royal servant whose full-time responsibility was to assist the king during his bathroom breaks, as in help wipe. Historians say the position held great influence at court, but let's be real, no amount of political clout justifies being elbow-deep in royal bowel movements. Somewhere in heaven, there's a very confused saint. In regular households, the chamber pot usually got dumped into the street, through the window, without warning. The term gardilou, from the French garde à l'eau, watch out for the water, was sometimes shouted as a polite heads-up before the day's waste made its glorious descent onto the public walkway. Did everyone shout it? Not really. Did people get hit frequently? There's probably a saint for that too. Stairs, no thanks. Lazy nobles would often just pee into pots and leave them under the bed until someone else found them, usually by accident with their foot. And in large towns, if you were lucky, you had access to a cesspit, a deep hole that held human waste until it overflowed like some sort of fecal volcano. These pits were occasionally cleaned by gong farmers' men who literally made their living digging through the worst smells in Europe. They worked at night, earned decent money, and were legally required to live far away from everyone else. Can't imagine why. Public latrines were few and far between, and if you did stumble upon one, chances are it was a wooden plank over a river, or a pit full of horrors that made your soul weep. Some towns built shared toilets on bridges. Others designated specific alleys as poop zones. If it rained, everything washed downhill. If it didn't, it just stayed, until the rats claimed it as real estate. So the next time you stumble half asleep toward your pristine, flushable, soft-seated, mildly scented bathroom, whisper a silent thank you to progress. Because once upon a time, relieving yourself meant sharing a pot, avoiding falling feces, and possibly hiring someone to carry your poop like it was crown jewels. Medieval life didn't come with nightmares. It was the nightmare. Imagine walking into a medieval sermon smelling like a rosebush dipped in holy water. Sounds refreshing, right? Well, in the Middle Ages it might have gotten you labelled a heretic. That's because for centuries the church didn't just discourage cleanliness, it basically declared war on it. Clean skin meant a dirty soul, and if you bathed too much, people assumed you were either French or up to something deeply sinful. You see, the church wasn't just the place you went to confess your weird medieval problems. It was the moral GPS of the age, and it had strong opinions about soap. Bathing in the church's view encouraged vanity and immodesty. It required nudity, privacy, and attention to the body, which all sounded suspiciously like things Satan would enjoy. The cleaner you were, the more likely you were to tempt someone, or worse, yourself. Because why scrub your thighs unless you're planning to use them? Monks and nuns were praised for going years, decades without washing. Some saints were literally canonized for being human compost heaps. Take St. Agnes of Rome, who reportedly never once washed her feet in her life. That wasn't just poor hygiene, it was spiritual dedication. Dirt was a badge of honor. Smelling like sanctified cheese meant you had your priorities straight. Even medieval religious art reinforced the message. The devil was often painted as suspiciously well-groomed, shiny hair, polished hooves, a six-pack that said, "I exfoliate." Meanwhile, holy men were depicted with wild beards, tattered robes, and a visible odour line radiating from their bodies like a cartoon. The message was clear: clean is seductive, dirty is divine, so go roll in the mud and get closer to God. Bathhouses, already sketchy in the church's eyes for their communal nudity, and occasional orgies became full-blown enemies of the cross. By the 14th century, many religious leaders were actively pushing to shut them down. Public bathing. Oh, a moral gateway drug. You enter hoping to rinse off some sheep sweat and leave with lust in your heart and rosemary in your underpants. Better to stink than to sin. This ideology trickled down much like chamber pot contents into the culture at large. Parents discouraged children from bathing. Schools didn't teach hygiene because they thought it distracted from prayer. Even when plagues hit and science started whispering that maybe filth wasn't fantastic, many priests doubled down. God sends illness, not bacteria. Scrubbing your armpits is not going to stop divine punishment. But of course hypocrisy ran strong. High-ranking clergy often ignored their own rules, using perfumes, scented gloves and private baths behind cathedral walls. One bishop in Paris was caught importing rose oil and silk towels for holy purposes. Sure, very holy armpits. Meanwhile, peasants were being told their stench was a blessing, and their boils were probably lessons from heaven. So the next time someone tells you cleanliness is next to godliness, feel free to correct them not in the Middle Ages. Back then, godliness came with fleas, fungus, and a smell strong enough to make your sins leave your body voluntarily. Praise be. If you think your kitchen gets messy after a dinner party, try being a medieval villager in mid-January surrounded by animal waste, spoiled cabbage, and something leaking from the roof that definitely isn't rain. Hygiene wasn't just a challenge, it was an unwinnable war. You didn't live near filth, you lived in it. The streets weren't paved, the roofs were thatched with straw and mystery bugs, and your house was one strong wind away from becoming a compost heap. The average villager woke up to mud, manure and misery, and that was before breakfast. Now imagine sharing your single-room hut with your family, your chickens, maybe a goat, and that one weird uncle who hasn't left since the harvest festival. Beds were straw piles crawling with lice. Walls were made of wattle and daub, a mixture of sticks, mud, and enough bugs to qualify for their own census. The floor, dirt, just dirt. You swept it not to clean it, but to rearrange the dust into less humiliating patterns. Garbage disposal. Not a thing. You tossed your food scraps into the street, same as your bodily waste, broken tools and dead pets. Over time, the roads turned into sludge trails of decay and despair. Rain just made the problem wetter. Dry weather made it dustier. Either way, your shoes didn't stand a chance, and neither did your dignity. If a modern person took one step into a medieval village, their immune system would just file for divorce. Animals roamed freely, adding their own fragrant contributions. Pigs, chickens, dogs and cows wandered in and out of homes, occasionally pooping on the hearth like they owned the place. There were no fences, no pens, just a shared understanding that everyone was going to smell terrible and pretend it was normal. And when the animals died, you might eat them, you might bury them, or you might just leave them behind the cottage until something larger dragged them away. Nature's clean-up crew. Bathing wasn't impossible, it was just incredibly impractical. You had to heat water over a fire, carry it to a tub if you even had one, and hope no one needed that water to cook, clean or extinguish your thatched roof when it inevitably caught fire. Most villagers opted to wash only the visible bits on holidays, face, hands, maybe feet if someone is getting married. Anything more than that was considered suspicious and potentially French. Even when attempts were made to be clean, the results were questionable at best. People cleaned their teeth with sticks, laundered their clothes by beating them against rocks, and swept their homes using bundles of twigs that mostly relocated the filth, rather than removing it. Soap, if they had it, was the harsh kind made from animal fat, and lye the kind that cleaned dirt and skin off in equal measure. Afterward you didn't feel clean. You felt exfoliated by God's wrath. And yet despite all this, villagers endured. They laughed, loved, raised children, and occasionally survived to the ripe old age of 35. They didn't win against filth, but they made it a roommate. A smelly, uninvited, fungal roommate who never paid rent. Life wasn't clean, but it was lived. And honestly, the fact that anyone found time for romance amid all that stink is either beautiful or terrifying. Medieval justice wasn't just brutal, it was disgustingly public. You didn't get a quiet fine or a strongly worded letter from the authorities. You got shackled to a wooden frame in the centre of town, exposed to the elements, the gossip, and most importantly the projectiles. Stocks and pillories were medieval open mic nights for cruelty, and the audience brought produce rotten, mushy, and sometimes still twitching. If you were really unpopular, they upgraded from tomatoes to dead rats, and whatever they scooped out of their chamber pots that morning. Yes, you read that right, poop throwing was part of the entertainment. Villagers didn't just throw it, they saved it for special occasions. There's something unsettling about a society that planned its bowel movements around judicial schedules, but here we are. And since no one was bathing regularly, what you got hit with in the stocks wasn't just fresh, it was fermented, layered, aged in the sun like fine medieval horror. Being punished in public wasn't just humiliating, it was sticky. Punishment could last hours or even days. In that time you'd be soaked by rain, sunburnt, bitten by flies, and marinated in whatever the town felt like hurling that day. Children would poke you with sticks, old ladies would spit biblical insults, and the local drunks would take turns arguing over whether your crime deserved turnips or turds. And don't expect sympathy. If you cried, they laughed. If you fainted, someone probably drew something unholy on your face with coal. Let's not forget the smell. A person restrained in the stocks couldn't get up to use the toilet because, surprise, they were the toilet. They often soiled themselves while being pelted, which only increased the town's enthusiasm. This wasn't justice. This was medieval content. Everyone got a front row seat to your humiliation, and if they were lucky, a splash of something foul to remember it by. Even punishments meant to be symbolic, like wearing a shame mask or being paraded on a donkey backwards, ended up being scent-based torture. These masks were made of iron, often lined with wool or leather, and absolutely never cleaned. You'd sweat in them, drool in them, and inhale your own panic. And the donkey. Let's just say it wasn't freshly shampooed either. You finished your sentence with emotional scars and the unmistakable smell of barnyard regret. So no medieval justice wasn't clean or quick or fair. It was messy, long, and often launched at you from someone's second-story window. When you think of cruel and unusual, remember, the most common punishment involved strangers throwing fermented cabbages and human waste at your open mouth. And you thought traffic court was bad. Let's talk about medieval women and hygiene, because if you think men had it rough, just wait until you hear how society treated anyone with a uterus. There's this romantic idea that medieval women were delicate flowers, brushing their long hair by candlelight and dabbing rosewater on their wrists. Nope. Try brushing your hair once a month with a comb carved from cow bone while crouched behind a pigsty, swatting away lice with the same hand you just used to stir porridge. Hygiene wasn't beauty, it was survival, and most days even that was optional. Start with the basics: menstruation. No tampons, no pads, no heating pads, no muddle, just moss. Literally moss. or rags, or wool scraps, or if you were poor, and most women were absolutely nothing, you bled into your clothes, into your bedding, into the earth, and just hoped it didn't ruin your only skirt. Pain relief. The best you got was being told it was God punishing Eve. And if you dared complain, you were hysterical, possessed, or in need of leech therapy. Bathing was a rare event made more difficult by privacy or the complete lack of it. A woman trying to wash herself might be interrupted by children, livestock, or her husband yelling about soup. There were no bathrooms, no bathtubs unless you were rich, and no locks on anything. Even wealthy women had to bathe with attendants hovering nearby to assist read judge, and while some noble women used perfumed oils or floral waters, the average woman was lucky if she could rinse her underarms in peace once a month. Privacy wasn't a luxury, it was a myth. Hair care. An adventure in oil, ash and hope. Medieval women often used lard or vinegar to clean their hair, then combed it endlessly to remove lice, which were so common they were practically family. Head coverings weren't just for modesty, they were there to hide the ecosystem living on your scalp. And if you were married, double the pressure to look presentable, smell passable, and still churn butter like your soul depended on it. Feminine mystique. Try feminine exhaustion. And childbirth. Oh dear God, childbirth. You think hygiene's bad now? Try giving birth in a room lit by tallow candles surrounded by women whispering prayers, while one of them boils old linens to wrap the baby in. No sterilization, no gloves, no clue. If the baby lived, it was a miracle. If the mother lived, it was suspicious. Midwives were often accused of witchcraft just for knowing how to cut an umbilical cord without killing someone. Despite all this, women persisted. They created herbal salves, whispered hygiene secrets to daughters, and shared vinegar recipes like they were sacred scrolls. They combated social rules, bodily disasters, and actual filth with resilience that deserves a medal, or at least a bath. But instead they got judged. For bleeding for bathing, for smelling for not smelling enough. It wasn't hygiene they feared, it was everyone else's opinion about it. So the next time you see a medieval painting of a serene woman in a flowing gown, just know underneath that gown was probably a week's worth of sweat, a homemade sanitary pad made of rabbit fur, and a woman mentally drafting a list of people she'd curse if she ever did become a witch. If you ever catch yourself complaining about modern doctors' long waits, cold stethoscopes, confusing insurance bills, just remember in medieval times your doctor might literally prescribe you boiled puppy lungs and urine smoothies. Medicine back then wasn't science. It was more like an aggressive guessing game fueled by superstition and things that smelled like death. The average cure was basically a dare. You had a fever, drink blood. You had the plague, rub crushed emeralds on your tongue and hope you die fashionably. Medieval doctors didn't believe in germs. Germs weren't invented yet. Instead, they subscribed to the glorious and completely made-up theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If those were out of balance, you got sick. If you had too much phlegm, for example, they might recommend spicy food bloodletting or attaching leeches to your eyeballs. And don't even ask what happened if you were low on black bile, they'd probably just bury you preemptively. Speaking of bloodletting, let's talk about leeches. Oh yes, these slimy little vampires were the medieval version of a cleanse. Feeling anxious? Leeches. Bloated leeches. Cursed by a goat. More leeches. Some doctors kept entire leech collections like pets, except instead of cuddling them, they stuck them to your inner thighs and prayed for the best. It was like acupuncture, but worse and wetter. Then there were the potions. God help us, the potions. You had concoctions made from fermented dung, mashed snails, powdered mummies, burnt hedgehogs, and virgin's milk, which we still don't have a clear definition for. Some recipes included 9-day-old urine to be drunk before sunrise while chanting Psalm 38. Others recommended wearing a dead mole in your shoe to ward off headaches. Not ingesting it, mind you. Wearing it. Because that's the line we draw, apparently. Oh, and doctors didn't exactly wash their hands. Why would they? There was no understanding of bacteria, and soap was reserved for laundry or witches. Medical instruments were reused across patients without cleaning, because nothing says healing like sharing a rusty blade with a guy who just died. If your wound got infected, they called it God's will. If your wound didn't get infected, they also called it God's will. Basically, God was blamed for everything except the doctor's inability to distinguish between a tumour and a toad bite. Midwives and herbalists often. Women were usually the ones who actually knew what they were doing, but naturally they were called witches, and occasionally burned at the stake for having the audacity to know what chamomile did. Men in robes with zero medical training were taken more seriously than women who'd delivered 50 babies and could cure a cough with garlic and honey. Misogyny, but with extra pus. In the end, going to a medieval doctor was a gamble. You might leave with a recipe for boiled squirrel brain tea. You might leave with fewer limbs, or you might not leave at all. The only thing you were guaranteed was an empty coin purse and a body that smelled slightly worse than when you came in. But hey, you probably had a new leech friend. Win-win. If you thought medieval life couldn't get more ridiculous, allow me to introduce you to one of the most fragrant pillars of the economy poo. Yes, feces, excrement, the brown gold of the Middle Ages. In a world without fertilizers, indoor plumbing, or basic dignity, human and animal waste wasn't just tolerated, it was valuable. People collected it, traded it, and in some villages it was practically a form of currency. Welcome to Poo Economics 101. Let's start with the basics. Crops don't grow on hope and good intentions, they grow on dung. And while manure from cows, pigs and chickens was always in high demand, human waste, politely called night soil, had its own disgusting little market. Poor families would shovel their own leavings into buckets and sell it to local farmers. If you had a large pooping family, congratulations, you were sitting on a financial asset, literally. In larger towns, the collection of night soil was an actual job. Nightmen or gong farmers would go door to door or cesspit to cesspit, scooping out human waste under the cover of darkness. Why darkness? Because even medieval people didn't want to make eye contact during that process. These men were paid surprisingly well, considering they spent every shift ankle deep in societal failure. Their work was vital to urban sanitation, also horrifying. Peasant households often had compost heaps behind their homes, where waste from animals, kitchens and humans all mingled together like a very smelly family reunion. This heap would be periodically stirred with a pitchfork, a cursed object at that point, and later carried out to the fields to fertilize crops. No gloves, no masks, just you, your hands, and the intimate knowledge that last week's stew was now this week's turnip booster. The circle of life had odours. Some landowners taxed their peasants not in money or grain, but in manure quotas. That's right, your worth could be calculated by how much dung you could deliver. Miss your quota, expect fines. Or worse, more labour. And since most peasants couldn't afford livestock, many had no choice but to make up the difference with personal contributions. Suddenly bathroom breaks weren't just necessary, they were productive. This poo economy also fueled turf wars, literal turf. Feces-enriched night soil made certain plots of land more fertile, which made them more valuable, which led to arguments, bribes, and occasionally fistfights over the rights to dump there. Imagine arguing over who gets to poop on which acre. Now imagine losing that argument. That's medieval real estate. Naturally, all of this made the average village smell like a warm compost bin that someone cried into. But people accepted it because to them, filth wasn't just survival, it was income. You didn't just live in squalor, You invested in it. Modern folks invest in cryptocurrency. Medieval folks invested in cow plops, and honestly theirs was more stable. So the next time you grumble about doing your taxes, remember there was once a man in a field holding a bucket of human waste calculating his family's financial future based on how much they'd pooped that week. Medieval economics, it was rough, it was real, and it definitely didn't smell like success. If you've ever walked through a modern city and complained about the smell of hot garbage on a summer day, congratulations, you wouldn't last 5 minutes in a medieval town. These places weren't just dirty, they were apocalyptic. Imagine a landfill that learned how to speak Latin and collect taxes. Streets weren't paved with cobblestones and charm, they were layered with filth waste and emotional damage. The cities of the Middle Ages weren't built on hopes and dreams, they were built on rot. Sanitation in medieval cities was a theoretical concept at best. There were no garbage trucks, no waste collection, no citywide plumbing. Trash was thrown directly into the street where it mingled with manure, spoiled food, dead animals, and that one guy who probably should have been buried weeks ago. Rain just spread it around like butter on misery toast. Summer, everything baked into a sticky stew of regret. Winter, everything froze temporarily, preserving the stink like a cursed medieval popsicle. Sewage. Let's talk about it. Most cities had open sewers. Literal trenches running down the middle of the street filled with human waste urine and the occasional lost shoe or dog. These were called kennels or channels, but don't let the cute names fool you. They were rivers of nightmares. People walked beside them daily, casually hopping over streams of disease while eating meat pies. If you slipped, congratulations, you just joined the ranks of medieval martyrs who died from falling into their own city. And it wasn't just the streets. Homes were filthy too. Most people lived in cramped one-room shacks made of wood and whatever the local livestock hadn't chewed. The floors were dirt, the walls were mouldy, and the windows, if they existed, were usually just holes covered with cloth or wax paper, perfect for letting in light rats and the persistent aroma of your neighbour's chamber pot. Upstairs neighbours, they dumped waste directly out the window. Hope you weren't passing by on laundry day. Markets. Oh dear God, the markets! They weren't the bustling, colourful plazas you see in movies. They were blood-soaked mud pits where butchers hacked animals in the open air, fishmongers sold 3-day-old trout in 90-degree heat, and farmers casually dropped off vegetables still covered in both soil and horse urine. Flies reigned supreme, rats ran the economy, and the smell a charming mix of death, digestion, and disappointment. Disease naturally thrived in this environment. Bubonic plague, typhoid, dysentery. These weren't rare occurrences, they were part of city life. Getting sick was expected. Getting better was a surprise. If you survived the streets, the rats, and the food that looked suspiciously like yesterday's regrets, you were considered sturdy, or possibly already dead on the inside. But the worst part, people got used to it. Your nose stopped fighting after a while. The human brain, desperate for survival, reclassified rotting donkey in the gutter as background texture. People didn't just tolerate the filth, they designed their lives around it. Kids played next to open cesspools, lovers courted in pig blood puddles, and somewhere someone still believed this was the pinnacle of civilization. So yes, medieval cities were vibrant centres of trade, politics and culture. But they were also trash volcanoes with cathedrals on top. You didn't visit a medieval city, you survived it, and if you made it out with your shoes, your health and your soul intact, you were either very lucky or already nose blind to the apocalypse. You'd think that in a world where everything smelled like the back end of a dragon being clean would make you a hero, a refreshing breeze in a world of farts. But in the Middle Ages, if you were too clean, people got nervous. Like, Maybe you're a witch or a French spy, nervous. Personal hygiene wasn't just rare, it was suspicious. In a society where everyone smelled like a compost heap in denial, the one person who didn't reek stood out like a daisy in a dung pile. The logic, if you can call it that, went something like this: the body is sinful, and washing it too often means you're obsessed with it. Vanity, pride, slippery slope to dancing, laughing, and next thing you know, heresy. Some folks even believed that scrubbing too hard could wash away your soul. So instead of celebrating cleanliness, people side-eyed it, like it came with horns and a tail. You smell like roses, burn her. She's clearly in league with Satan or worse from Italy. Even among the upper class, being overly tidy came with social consequences. A nobleman who bathed weekly might be seen as effeminate, decadent, or foreign, three things you definitely didn't want to be during a time when masculinity was measured in sword size and body odour. Nobles who used scented oils and perfumed gloves were sometimes mocked for being soft, which is hilarious considering these same men wore tights and screamed in falsetto when wounded. Masculine hygiene was a paradox. You were supposed to smell like power and old beef, not lavender and self-respect. Women fared even worse. A woman who took care of her appearance was automatically branded one of three things: a witch, a seductress, or an out-of-control Frenchwoman. Midwives who washed their hands too often were accused of practicing unnatural medicine. Young girls who liked floral water were warned that their interest in cleanliness would lead to pregnancy theft or worse, dancing, the safest bet for a medieval woman. Smell like turnips, keep your head down, and try not to look like you enjoy being alive. This cultural suspicion around hygiene didn't just stop at body care. If your home was too clean, people assumed you were hiding something like vanity, foreign influence, or the devil's favourite recipe book. There are documented cases of priests warning their congregations not to keep their homes unnaturally tidy, lest they invite evil spirits, or the kind of judgment reserved for people with curtains. Basically, if your cottage didn't look like a mudslide inside a barn, you were clearly trying too hard. And trying too hard was dangerous. And then came the ultimate medieval insult: you smell too good. That wasn't a compliment, it was a red flag. It meant you were probably vain, probably immoral, and definitely not local. Inquisitors sometimes listed excessive bathing and use of foreign perfumes as evidence during witch trials. Imagine that getting burned at the stake because your armpits didn't cause birds to drop dead mid-air. Cleanliness wasn't next to godliness, it was halfway to the gallows. So in a world where stink equaled piety and scrubbing was subversive, it's no wonder that hygiene took a 1,000-year vacation. Being clean meant being suspicious. Being fragrant meant being dangerous. And being odourless. That meant you were probably cursed, or worse, educated. So here we are, after 19 gloriously grimy chapters of piss buckets, plague masks, goat fat shampoo and weaponized breath. We've arrived at the final truth bomb: modern life, for all its complaints, smells amazing. We may whine about traffic, Wi-Fi outages and soy milk shortages, but at least we're not dodging airborne feces in a street stew of death. Your biggest olfactory challenge is walking past a gym. A medieval peasant's version was surviving the air. We flush toilets. We wash our hands. We have soap that foams, not soap that peels your skin off and makes your enemies weep. We have toothbrushes, deodorant, hot showers, private bathrooms, laundry machines, and a legal system that strongly discourages pooping out windows. We invented entire industries around not smelling terrible cologne detergent plumbing HVAC systems. Our ancestors, they invented excuses and then died of trench foot. Let's be honest, our noses are soft now, coddled, spoiled. If someone forgets deodorant for a day, it's a human rights violation. But in the Middle Ages, the bar was on the floor and then someone pooped on it. The very idea of smelling nice was so revolutionary it could get you accused of witchcraft. People walked around coated in layers of filth, perfume, superstition, and dried blood, and just called it Tuesday. So next time you light a scented candle or take a long hot shower, remember that simple luxury was once a heretical act. You can walk into a drugstore and choose between 42 brands of mint toothpaste. Your ancestors chewed on burnt twigs and prayed their teeth didn't fall out mid-sentence. You flush your toilet without thinking. They dropped waste into moats, rivers, and occasionally each other's heads. And sure, modern life still stinks sometimes. Emotionally, existentially, maybe even politically, but it doesn't stink literally. Our world is fragranced, sterilized, lemon-scented, and mostly poop-free. You can walk through a city without holding your breath. You can go on a date without hoping your partner doesn't smell like a fermented badger. You can exist without being nose-punched by reality every 10 seconds. So thank your nose. Thank it for surviving this read. Thank it for existing in an age where lavender isn't suspicious and cleanliness isn't criminal. You made it through the stink age without fainting or dry heaving. That's progress, baby. That's civilization. Now go wash your hands and whisper a little thank you to plumbing.